Hello, this is Eye on Africa. I'm Yena Lee, and these are your headlines on the continent tonight. The UN's human rights body calls for a prompt and independent probe into reports of rape and sexual harassment at Sudan's anti-coup protests on Sunday. In Niger, France kills a top member of the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Jihadist was a key suspect in the murder of 6 French NGO workers. And Egyptian authorities ban shishas in public as a part of its fight against COVID-19. Avid smokers, though, are setting up their own pipes at home. We start the show in Sudan, where medics confirm that a second person has died after Sunday's protests. The extent of the violence is beginning to surface, with a ministry-affiliated organisation adding that 2 women were raped at the demonstrations. The UN's Human Rights Office, meanwhile, announced that it has received 13 accusations of rape and gang rape, as well as other reports of sexual harassment, allegedly committed by security officers. The international body is calling for an independent investigation into these claims. And for more on this, earlier I spoke to Ravina Shamdasani. She's a spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office. I asked her what can be expected from Sudan's embattled generals.
We are very disappointed. We've been calling for the restraint in the handling of these protests. And while we did see some restraint initially on the 19th, later in the afternoon, security forces began using live ammunition against the protesters. They started using large amounts of tear gas and aiming, it appears, tear gas canisters directly at people. These are also very shocking reports of sexual violence against women. And it's the first time in the context of these protests that we've seen allegations against security forces using violence, sexual violence against women. Now, on the likelihood that there will be an investigation, in fact, there have been investigations. I understand that there was actually a hearing of an officer who belonged to the National Intelligence Security Services who was charged with killing a protester back in 2019. Now, there's a first hearing that's taking place now. So it is important for us to keep insisting on justice and accountability to ensure a prevention of such violations in the future.
Now, you said that this is the first time that we've had reports of sexual violence in these recent protests, but it's not the first time we're hearing about sexual violence since the uprising. What accountability has there been since those 2019 mass rapes at a Khartoum sit-in?
Yes, no, unfortunately, very little. And in the case of the rapes that we've documented over the weekend, we understand that the figures given by the government are much lower than what we are hearing. We're hearing of at least 13 women who were raped. Medical sources have reported this. 4 of the victims have actually filed complaints at the police station. And we are calling for prompt, urgent, independent investigations with a view to prosecution. The interim government, the authorities, need to ensure that this never happens again. They need to send a very clear signal to security forces that this is unacceptable.
Now, women have been playing a central role in the country's revolution. Is sexual violence a means to silence them and thus extinguish the movement?
You're right. Women have been playing a very important role since 2019 in the revolution, in the protests that have followed. Sexual violence is a tool that has been used in many conflicts to terrorize not only women, but also their families, because there is a stigma attached to sexual violence where the victims are blamed. So it's unfortunately used frequently in situations of armed conflict, but also in other situations where there is an attempt to silence dissent. It's not clear what was behind these very heinous rapes and gang rapes of women at the protests over the weekend, but you're right, it is often used to silence them.
And finally, Ravina, the UN is also concerned about intercommunal violence in Darfur. What are your priorities there?
No, there have been at least, since September, we've received reports that at least 250 civilians have been killed, and this is very likely to be an underestimate. Unfortunately, there's a real protection gap, and we understand that the state is working to try to fill that gap. The priority from our side is to ensure that there is that this protection gap is filled, but that it is filled effectively without leading to the perpetration of further human rights violations. So where security forces are being trained to go to Darfur and to manage this intercommunal conflict, they need to ensure this is done in line with international human rights law as well, that it doesn't actually make matters worse by sending in security forces that are ill-trained. This is essential. And it is also essential that there is individual criminal responsibility for the killings that have taken place, because otherwise what happens is there's a cycle of violence that's perpetrated against entire communities that are held responsible for a killing committed by one of their members. So accountability, again, is key.
The French army has announced that it's neutralized a high-ranking member of a terrorist organization. Soumana Boura was a key suspect in the 2020 Niger park attack. 8 NGO workers, mostly French citizens, were executed. The footage of their murder later published, allegedly by Boura. Nicholas Rushworth has the story.
The French army says jihadist Soumana Boura was killed in a drone strike as he was riding his motorcycle in Niger's Tillabéri region. He was one of the bosses of the so-called Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, in charge of dozens of fighters. The Islamic State group claimed responsibility for the killings last August of 6 French aid workers aged between 25 and 31 and their 2 local guides while they were visiting the Corée National Park, 60 kilometers from Niger's capital, Niamey. French forces killed another boss of the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara group, Adnan Abu Walid al-Sarwawi, this August. They believe he ordered the execution of the aid workers, while Soumana Boura is believed to have filmed the execution and overseen publication of the footage. 11 other people implicated in the murders have been arrested in Niger in recent months. France has begun to wind down operations in the Sahel. Its current deployment of about 5,000 in the region will be drawn down by about half by 2023.
Time now for a quick look at other stories we're following for you. Ethiopia's government says it's pushed out Tigrayan forces from 2 northern regions, contradicting the rebels' statement that they're retreating of their own free will. Federal forces and the TPLF continue their fight to control the narrative at every step of the conflict. Journalists and aid workers have had limited access to the area since the start. Thousands of civilians have, though, been killed in these past 13 months. South Africa's Jacob Zuma could spend Christmas at home, the latest in a legal saga. In June, the former president was sentenced to 15 months in prison for refusing to take part in a corruption probe. In September, he obtained medical parole. That decision was later overturned. Now, a court has granted him the chance to appeal the latest ruling. And AFCON organisers have once again dispelled fears over a potential cancellation. The president of the Confederation of African Football insisted that the continent's biggest footballing event will go as planned. Cameroon FA's new president Samuel Eto'o too has criticised reports suggesting the competition is in danger due to COVID, saying that if the Euros took place, AFCON 2 can go ahead. And finally, Egyptian authorities have banned shishas in public places once again. This as a part of COVID restrictions. Cafe owners risk a fine of 10,000 Egyptian pounds per pipe. That's around 560 euros. As a result, shisha lovers have started smoking at home. Our correspondent Edouard Dropsy reports from Cairo.
In the streets of Cairo, despite government requirements, few people wear masks, nor is there much social distancing. But a recently announced ban on shisha pipes is more or less respected. Rule breakers face fines of 560 euros and 1 year in prison. In this city centre cafe, sales of shisha made up 25% of the revenue. But even so, this waiter thinks the ban makes sense.
Of course it's affected my job, I won't lie. But we respect the government and the police because that's what's most important. So we respect the law, even though it has significant consequences for us. But public health is the most important thing.
So those who don't want to give up the habit have no choice other than to do it at home. Mohammed is preparing his pipe.
The government is banning the shisha at the coffee shops for the COVID. So when you want to smoke it, there is another way. You can smoke it at home. You buy yours. It's not very expensive. It's 300 pounds or 400 pounds. And you can smoke at home alone, but it's fine.
In his surgery, Dr. Yosri Akil sees large numbers of patients with lung infections. For him, banning shisha is a real public health measure.
Obviously, even forgetting about COVID or other infectious diseases, smoking shisha is very bad for the lungs. One of the most dangerous conditions is a chronic lung obstruction that can cause breathing difficulties.
Even if the shisha ban is for now only temporary, it could very easily be written into law in a more permanent way in the future.
That's it for Eye on Africa. Tonight's show was produced by Laura DiBiasio, Arno Pedram, and their team behind the cameras.
Тенденция государства российского в данный момент идет на сокрытие исторической правды.
The Gulag saw millions detained and tortured during decades until 1953. Though the repressions of Stalin may seem like a distant memory, historical truth is still a struggle.
Вот все, что осталось от двухэтажного дома, да, где мы планировали жить после судебных разбирательств с сотрудниками полиции.
And in modern-day Russia, many live in fear of a state that silences all criticism.
Что было так в 21 век, пока вот самого не коснется, никогда никто не поверит.
Watch The Gulag Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.